I bought this very beautiful Bulova Accutron watch that was made back in 1973 with the Accutron 218 movement from a seller on Etsy recently. And he claimed that it had been serviced by a watchmaker who took it apart and cleaned it and relubricated it and adjusted it for modern batteries. And it worked beautifully when it was just sitting on the table like it is now, but when I strapped it to my wrist, the movement would stop. And I couldn't figure out what was causing that sort of thing, and so I talked to a friend who had worked on these back in the 60s and 70s, an old retired watchmaker, and he suggested to me that probably the back gasket wasn't thick enough, and the back of the watch, when it was strapped down to my wrist, the pressure from that was pushing the back against the tuning fork inside, keeping it from vibrating, which would stop the movement. And so I opened it up, and this watch opens up a lot like the Vostok watches that I worked on in one of my other videos. You unscrew a retaining ring, and then you lift the retaining ring off, and then the back comes off. Now, here's what we've got. This is the gasket that the repairman had installed in it. That's the wrong gasket for this watch. And the blue thing you see here is actually a cardboard ring that I created as a temporary shim so that I could put the back on without it touching the tuning fork and damaging the watch. And that actually worked perfectly fine, but I wanted to use the actual correct gasket for it because this doesn't allow the watch to be waterproof. And so what I'm going to do here is I finally got the correct gasket for it. So I'm going to remove the incorrect gasket and my shim and then install the correct parts. So this is the correct gasket for it. It's not as wide as the one that the bad repairman had used, but it's thicker. And something else that's unusual is that when I tried to take the back off of it to look at it the first time, the back retaining ring was very loose. So the repairman who had installed the incorrect gasket knew that it didn't work because when you tighten the back down all the way, it would also stop running. I didn't even have to be putting pressure on the back with my wrist or touching it with my fingers. Just having the back tightened down properly was enough to stop the tuning fork from running. So the guy who put this thing together before knew that it wasn't working properly and still did it anyway and gave it to his customer, who's the man that I bought it from. Use my tweezers here to get everything positioned correctly. There we go. Now we will put the back on it and tighten it down. Make sure that it works then. There we go. Now the back has a little pin sticking up there that goes into this slot, so it can only go in one way. When I screwed the case back down, it seemed to be working fine with the new gasket, but when I turned the watch over face up, it started making a loud buzzing sound, which indicated that the tuning forks were probably buzzing against the back, so the new gasket wasn't quite thick enough, I don't think. These aren't original Bulova gaskets, they're no longer manufactured. They're aftermarket ones I was able to find, so they may not be thick enough. So what I've done here, I tried putting the wide gasket that the other repairman had used along with the new Accutron gasket, and that made it too thick. I couldn't get the back on. So what I've done here is I put my homemade shim back in, and then I put the new Bulova gasket. Well, it's not an original Bulova gasket, but the one that's supposed to be made for the Accutron on top of it. So hopefully that will give the right thickness. I can put the back on without the tuning fork touching the back, but will give adequate waterproofing. So let's see if that'll work. Yeah, I can screw the back on now because there's enough of the threads visible. So let's go ahead and put that on, put the retaining ring on, tighten it down, and see how that works out. I've tightened the back down nice and tight. So let's flip it over and see if it works. Yep, it's running and working perfectly. I don't hear any of the buzzing sound or anything, so I think we'll go ahead and have to stick with that. It's too bad that the new gaskets weren't quite thick enough, but sometimes you have to improvise when you're working on watches this old. This watch was made in 1973, so it's older than I am. I was born in 1975, so I'll be 50 years old in a couple months, and this watch is about 52 years old. So when you can't get the original factory parts for it, sometimes the aftermarket parts available aren't quite perfect, and you have to make your own parts, and that's what I've ended up having to do there. but the watch is working, and the new gasket should make it water resistant, at least enough that when I'm sweating or whatever in this heat, because right now it's really hot in Indiana, that won't seep into the back of it or anything. I wouldn't take this watch swimming or take a shower with it or anything like that because it was never made to be that water resistant to begin with. But you need enough water resistance that if you sweat on it or if you splash a little water on it when you're washing your hands, it's not going to get into the mechanism, and this hopefully should be adequate for that.